To PNL, right? Firstly, let me introduce to you the concept of something called operating leverage. Now, typically, this is how a costing PNL looks like. So, when say you're a manufacturing company, or say for example, you are trying to assess what is say the unit level profitability of a business, so on and so forth. This is what a costing PL looks like. So, you start with something called sales. When you reduce variable cost from sales, you get something which is known as contribution. So say for example, if you've done 100 rupees of sales, and in order for you to make that 100 rupees of product, you require 50 rupees of variable cost. The contribution that comes, so the contribution is again a technical, it's again a jargon which is used. So the contribution of that business is 50 rupees. Now say from that contribution you reduce fixed costs. So say fixed costs are 30 rupees. Now sales minus variable cost, you get contribution, and fixed cost is 30 rupees. So when you reduce fixed cost from contribution, you get something called as EBIT. From there you reduce interest costs, then you get something called PBT. So this is purely from a costing perspective, right? This is not from an accounting perspective. This is for you to understand what are the unit level economics of a business. Now, typically the information around this is not readily available. So maybe you'll have to try and find some of this math for yourself. Say for example, in the case of Zomato, right? They've given you something called average order value. What is the unit level economics for delivering one order? What is the cost of my delivery? What is the discount? So on and so forth. And you'll arrive at something called contribution per order. Then you have fixed costs. So this would include salaries, IT support, so on and so forth. And then in EBIT, interest cost, PBT. That's the flow in terms of when you look at it from the perspective of, say for example, if today you want to set up a factory, you would want to know these numbers. And why would you want to know these numbers? Allow me to introduce to you a concept called operating leverage. Now you'll often see, experts talk about this on TV, or you'll often see this word being used loosely in a lot of news articles as to this business has high operating leverage, or this business has high financial leverage, right? So let's first understand what is the concept of operating leverage. Simply put, if you were to calculate what operating leverage of a business is, you divide contribution by EBIT. So contribution divided by just give me a moment. Yeah. So when you divide contribution by EBIT, so that gives you something called operating leverage. So contribution number 1 divided by EBIT number 2 gives you something called operating leverage, right? What is the meaning of operating leverage? Typically in a business like say a hotels business, or say like an airline business, or say for example, let's take these two businesses as of now. So in a hotel business or in an airline business, there is very high operating leverage. And what is the meaning of very high operating leverage? So if you see, going from contribution to EBIT, you have something known as fixed costs. So typically if the fixed costs of a particular industry or of a particular line of business are high, that is a business which has high operating leverage, which basically means I have to always ensure that my contribution margins or the contribution of my business is enough for me to meet my fixed costs. Because the moment I'm not able to meet my fixed costs, my EBIT can become negative, right? So for any of these businesses which have high operating leverage, whether it's airlines, whether it's hotels, you will see they have to actively try and manage their top line, so that obviously at a variable cost level they might be contribution positive, but that again gets dependent on how much volume you're achieving, right? Because say for example, if you have the capacity to sell 100 nights and you're selling 10 nights, right? Obviously at an individual room level you might be profitable, but you also need to ensure that are your fixed costs getting met. So then you have something called a break-even point. So say if you do 30 nights, you break even, which is you meet your all fixed costs. So that is the prime concept behind what operating leverage is. Typically, if your operating leverage is high, that means you have high fixed costs, and it is important for you to ensure that your sales do not drop drastically. On the flip side, so this is on the disadvantage side. On the advantage side, if a business has high operating leverage, right, and the fixed costs are fairly high, suddenly if you see the top line grows by 10%, the bottom line might grow by 15% or it might grow by 20%, depending on what sort of operating leverage the business has, right? Which, by the way, if you don't have fixed costs or if you don't have operating leverage in the business, when there's a up cycle happening and your top line grows by 20%, there's a high chance your bottom line will also grow by 20%, right? Because the flow through of that money is fairly simple. So that is something which one needs to realize, and typically you will see whenever the industry goes through a downturn. So say for example, if I were to talk about the airlines industry, so when Jet almost went bust, suddenly you saw Indigo had a big re-rating and it also had a big run up, because there was a sense that Indigo will be able to now ramp up this, as a result of which, because it's a high operating leverage business, it will be able to generate more EBIT and ultimately more PAT, right? That was the sense when Jet went down. Typically, if you see right now, when people are looking at this whole unlocked trade opportunity, people are betting big on the hotel space again, because they feel that, hey, the occupancies will go up, the sales will go up, and as a result, because the business has high operating leverage, we might see a big delta coming in the coming years. Will I personally go and buy a hotel stock, or will I go personally and buy an airline stock? The answer is no, because of my biases and what I sort of understand a thing or two about the business. But this typically is the concept of operating leverage, and it is important for you to understand this in conjunction with what we studied in terms of what the industry overview is, right? So that's the concept of operating leverage. The second concept is of financial leverage. Now, when I have to really find out what financial leverage is, this is again, EBIT. EBIT becomes the numerator divided by PBT. PBT becomes the denominator, right? So when I divide EBIT by PBT, I get something called financial leverage. Now, no points for guessing. Financial leverage will be high if the debt burden on the business is high, and as a result, your interest costs will be high. So you need to ensure that I am generating enough EBIT so that my interest costs get met, and as a result, I am PBT positive. So that is what the concept of financial leverage is. Now, to really understand what happened in financial leverage, I would highly suggest you look at the quarterly numbers of Leela Hotel Venture. So Leela had a lot of foreign currency debt, and especially between 15 and 16 is the year you should look out for. So there was a point when quarterly Leela was making close to 126 crores of EBIT, and the interest burden they had quarterly was 130 crores. So as a result of which, whatever money they were making from the business was just going in servicing the debt, and at the end the PBT or PAT was negative. Now, when I divide or when I multiply operating leverage and financial leverage, I get something known as combined leverage. Or combined leverage typically means what amount of contribution is ultimately flowing into my PBT. So that is what the concept of combined leverage is. So combined leverage ultimately is, let me change the color so that this is not confusing for you. Yeah. So hold on. So when I divide contribution, that's 1, by PBT, that's 2. So contribution divided by PBT will give me something called combined leverage. That ultimately is what combined leverage is. This is again an academic term, because I just thought if I'm explaining to you operating leverage, I should also explain the other two terms which are there. Typically, from investment implication perspective, what is really important is operating leverage. Financial leverage, again, you get a sense whether the company is levered or not levered, and ultimately you have something called combined leverage, right? So what is really important from an investment implication is what operating leverage is all about. So let's say you have sales, your variable cost, you have contribution, right? And then you have fixed cost, and then you have EBIT, right? That is what is important. Now say today, for example, the selling price per unit of that product is 2 rupees, right? Variable cost is 1 rupee. So at a unit level, you have a contribution of 50%, which is 1 rupee, right? and let's put this as units. Right? Now say for example today you're selling 50 units. So you're doing 50 rupees of sales, you're doing 100 rupees of sales. The contribution that you have will be 50 rupees because your variable cost per unit is 1 rupee. And let's say the fixed cost is 20 rupees, right? So your EBIT is 30 rupees. With me until here, Dr. Manish? Let me know and then I'll proceed. All right. Now let's say I end up doing 70 units now, right? So at 70 units, I do 140 rupees in sales. I do 70 rupees in variable costs, and I have a contribution of 70 rupees, right? My fixed cost remains fixed at 20 and my EBIT becomes 50 rupees, right? That's what happens, right? So if I see my sales growth, right? My sales growth is 40%, right? My contribution growth again will be the same because my variable cost is fixed. That will also be 40%. My EBIT growth will be 67%. Why? Because my business, now if I were to calculate what my operating leverage here is, if I divide by contribution by EBIT, that's 1.7. Again, contribution by EBIT 1.4. So what has happened is I was in a high operating leverage business, right? My operating leverage has come down, right? So the way to look at operating leverage is, 1.7 was the operating leverage of this business that I was running. Now the moment, because my sales sort of grew by 40%, my EBIT actually grew by 67%. Why? Because my fixed costs remain fixed. Now let's say if I were to put this number as 30, right? And obviously it still remains 30. So my operating leverage was 2.5 times. So my EBIT growth was 100%. Let's say this fixed cost is 40 rupees, right? My operating leverage was 5 times. My EBIT growth became 200%. And this is typically what happens when you look at P&Ls of hotels, airlines, and typically when they have a bumper year, this is this massive sort of growth that you will see that happens because of this.